For months, the message was loud and confident. Women's basketball had arrived. The numbers were up. The audience was growing. The future was locked in. And then, almost overnight, something strange happened. The excitement faded, the screens went dark, and the silence became impossible to ignore. Because when the latest numbers dropped, they didn't just disappoint. They exposed a problem no one wanted to talk about. Here's the part that should make you pause. This wasn't some struggling startup with no backing. This was Unrivaled, a league branded as sustainable, innovative, and built to last. Star power on the court, media praise everywhere, big promises made early. And yet, when Season 2 quietly arrived, almost nobody showed up to watch. Not gradually, not slowly, just gone. And what makes this even more uncomfortable is that the system designed to boost these numbers couldn't save it. Which raises a much bigger question. If this is happening here, what does it really mean for the WNBA when it's time to renegotiate its future on television? Because once you see these numbers clearly, it's hard to unsee them. But to understand how things fell apart this fast, you have to go back to the moment everyone thought the battle was already won. At first, Unrivaled looked like a success story straight out of a highlight reel. Opening night buzz. Headlines celebrating record viewership. Social media exploding with clips, reactions, and bold declarations about a permanent shift in women's basketball. Analysts spoke with certainty. Fans felt validated. And the league carried itself like it had cracked the code. Momentum became the favorite word. Everything had momentum. Growth. Expansion. Sustainability. It sounded unstoppable. And on the surface, the numbers seemed to back it up. Season 1 debuted with viewership strong enough to silence critics and energize supporters. From the outside, it looked like the beginning of something that would only climb higher. But buried underneath all that celebration was a detail that barely anyone questioned at the time. The way ratings were being counted had changed. Quietly. Subtly. Nielsen adjusted how it measured audiences, pulling in more data sources, more connected TVs, more passive viewers. On paper, it made sense. Modernize the system. Capture more screens. Reflect how people actually watch. The result? Everything suddenly looked bigger. Healthier. More impressive than before. And that didn't just help Unrivaled. It boosted numbers across the board. Sports broadcasts everywhere began celebrating record growth. Even when actual viewing habits hadn't changed nearly as much as the headlines suggested. It was like upgrading the measuring tape and acting shocked when everything appeared taller. Still, nobody cared. Because the story felt good. Women's basketball was finally getting its moment, and questioning the numbers felt unnecessary, even uncomfortable. So the league leaned into it. The media ran with it, and the narrative locked in. Except momentum only matters if it survives the next chapter. And when Season 2 arrived, that's exactly where the story started to unravel. Because this time, there was no roar, no rush, no explosion of interest. Just a quiet return that exposed how fragile that momentum really was. And once the first real numbers came in, the illusion didn't just crack, it shattered. Season 2 didn't arrive with fireworks. It didn't arrive with urgency. In fact, for a lot of people, it barely arrived at all. There were no viral countdowns. No overwhelming push across timelines. No sense that something important was happening again. And that alone should have raised alarms, because sports don't survive on talent alone. They survive on awareness. Then the numbers dropped. Not rumors. Not speculation. Actual viewership data. And the reaction wasn't confusion. It was shock. Because this wasn't a small step backward. It wasn't a give-it time situation. The audience didn't slowly drift away. It disappeared. Primetime matchups, the slots designed to showcase the league at its strongest, struggled to pull in a fraction of what Season 1 delivered. Where opening night once cleared well over 300,000 viewers, Season 2's biggest moments were scraping together numbers that looked more like background noise than national interest. Afternoon games didn't fare much better. Some barely crossed into six figures, quietly airing while most potential viewers had no idea they were even happening. This wasn't a normal sophomore dip. This was a fall that felt immediate and brutal. Nearly 70% of the audience gone in a single year. And when you see a drop that steep, excuses stop working. Because here's the part nobody wants to admit. If Season 1 viewers were truly engaged, emotionally invested, habit-forming, locked in, they don't just vanish. Sports fans are creatures of routine. They show up again, even when things aren't perfect. When they don't, it's usually because something much deeper broke. What made this worse was the contrast. Just 12 months earlier, Unrivaled was being framed as the future. A league that figured out how to connect stars, storylines, and visibility. The blueprint everyone else was supposed to follow. But Season 2 exposed how much of that success relied on novelty instead of loyalty. And once novelty fades, the real test begins. The broadcasts told the story without saying a word. Quieter arenas. Fewer social reactions. Minimal post-game buzz. The kind of silence that doesn't spark debate because there's barely anyone left to argue. When prime time feels empty, it sends a message far louder than any headline ever could. What really stunned analysts wasn't just how low the numbers were, it was how fast they got there. There was no extended grace period, no slow erosion. From the opening weeks, it was clear the audience that once showed up out of curiosity didn't feel compelled to return. And that raises a dangerous question. If this league truly represented momentum, why did that momentum evaporate the moment it wasn't new anymore? Because momentum doesn't collapse unless it was borrowed in the first place. At that point, comparisons started creeping in. Same time slots from the year before. Same networks. Same basic structure. But wildly different results. And when people tried to soften the blow by saying, well, it's still early, the data refused to cooperate. Early numbers weren't trending upward. They were flat. In some cases, even slipping further. That's when concern replaced optimism. Not outrage. Not mockery. Concern. Because this wasn't about opinions anymore. It was about patterns. And patterns like this make executives nervous. Networks don't panic over one bad game. They panic when behavior changes. When viewers don't come back. When attention moves elsewhere and doesn't return. And the most uncomfortable part? This all happened despite conditions that should have helped. Which brings us to the detail that makes this collapse even harder to ignore. Because even with modern rating systems designed to make broadcasts look bigger than they really are, Unrivaled still couldn't escape the drop. And that's where the situation goes from disappointing to alarming. Here's where the story stops being uncomfortable and starts becoming impossible to ignore. Because if Unrivaled's viewership collapse had happened under old-school measurement systems, there would be an easy escape hatch. Blame outdated tracking. Claim audiences moved to streaming. Say the numbers don't reflect reality anymore. That playbook works all the time. Except this time, it didn't apply. Nielsen didn't just tweak its process, it rebuilt it. The new Data Plus panel system pulls from connected televisions, streaming behavior, external data feeds, and digital viewing habits that traditional ratings used to miss entirely. It's designed to capture people who never sit down with cable, never flip channels, and never watch in the classic way. In other words, this system exists to make modern sports look bigger. Thursday night football benefited. Primetime events across multiple leagues suddenly celebrated record-setting audiences. Advertisers loved it. Networks loved it. Everyone loved it. Everyone except Unrivaled. Because despite all of this additional data, all of these extra screens being counted, the audience barely budged. Some broadcasts saw only minimal improvement. Others didn't move at all. And that's when the math started telling a story no PR statement could spin. If you expand the measurement pool and the result is still weak, the issue isn't measurement. It's interest. That realization hit like a cold splash of water. Because it meant the viewers weren't hiding on other platforms. They weren't quietly watching somewhere else. They simply weren't watching. The league that launched itself as cutting-edge, future-proof, and digitally fluent couldn't take advantage of a system literally designed to protect it from this exact scenario. And that contradiction is devastating. What made it worse was the timing. This wasn't happening during an experimental phase or a chaotic launch. This was Season 2, the moment when audiences are supposed to stabilize, when curiosity turns into habit, when casual viewers decide whether this becomes part of their routine. Instead, the routine never formed. And once analysts started lining up the numbers side by side, the gap became impossible to defend. Season 1 numbers benefited from novelty, media enthusiasm, and expanded measurement. Season 2 had the same expanded measurement, but none of the excitement. The result was a clear signal that the original audience wasn't as solid as advertised. That's when the conversation shifted behind closed doors. Because executives don't argue about ideology. They don't care about narratives. They care about patterns that affect money. And patterns like this force uncomfortable reassessments. Sponsors start asking harder questions. Networks start recalculating projections. Investors quietly revisit assumptions they once felt confident about. When a league's second season collapses this fast, it suggests the foundation was thinner than anyone admitted. And that's the real danger here. Not criticism, not headlines, but doubt. Doubt spreads quietly. It doesn't trend. It doesn't spark outrage. It shows up in meetings, spreadsheets, and renegotiations. It shows up when future seasons are planned with smaller expectations and less confidence. And this is where Unrivaled's situation becomes more than just its own problem. Because this league wasn't operating in isolation. It was positioned as proof. Proof that women's basketball demand had permanently shifted. Proof that the audience was no longer niche. Proof that growth had arrived and would sustain itself. But when the proof starts falling apart, everything built on it starts shaking too. And now the question isn't just why viewers left. It's whether they were ever truly there to begin with. Which leads directly to the most uncomfortable part of this entire story. The role of promotion, awareness, and silence. Because when Season 2 began, a shocking number of people didn't even know it was happening. By the time people started asking where the viewers went, the answer was already hiding in plain sight. They didn't all lose interest. They weren't protesting. They weren't quietly boycotting anything. A massive portion of them simply never knew the season had started again. That might sound unbelievable, but it explains everything. Season 1 of Unrivaled didn't succeed by accident. It was loud. It was everywhere. Social media clips circulated nonstop. Sports pages pushed highlights. Commentary shows debated its meaning. Even casual fans felt like they were supposed to care, because the league positioned itself as an event. Watching wasn't optional. It was part of the conversation. Season 2 felt completely different. There was no urgency. No widespread reminders. No sense of this is happening right now. The league returned with the energy of a soft relaunch instead of a continuation of momentum. Broadcast times shifted quietly. Promotions were minimal. And unless you were already paying close attention, it was easy to miss entirely. That's a fatal mistake in sports entertainment. Because fans don't schedule their lives around leagues they're not constantly reminded about. Attention is fragile. If you don't fight for it, something else wins. And while Unrivaled assumed Season 1 loyalty would carry over, reality had other plans. This wasn't just a marketing slip. It was a breakdown in awareness strategy. Some supporters admitted they found out games were happening after they aired. Others stumbled across clips days later with no idea they missed live broadcasts. And that silence mattered, because sports thrive on shared moments. When nobody knows when to show up, the energy disappears before the game even begins. And here's the uncomfortable truth. If you have to explain that something exists, it's already losing. The league leaned heavily on the assumption that Season 1 success created a built-in audience. But Season 1 didn't build habits, it built curiosity. And curiosity fades fast when it's not fed. Without consistent reminders, hype doesn't roll forward. It collapses. What makes this worse is that promotion should have been the easiest fix. The infrastructure already existed. Social platforms were in place. Networks had access. The audience had already been identified. But instead of doubling down, everything felt quieter, smaller, and strangely hesitant. Almost like confidence had already started to slip. And once the awareness dropped, the ratings followed instantly. Not because the product suddenly became bad. Not because the athletes stopped performing. But because nobody shows up to a game they don't know is happening. This is the part that exposes how fragile the entire growth narrative really was. True momentum survives silence. Manufactured momentum doesn't. When the noise stopped, the audience didn't wait around, it moved on. And that creates a dangerous feedback loop. Lower awareness leads to lower viewership. Lower viewership leads to weaker promotion. Weaker promotion confirms declining interest. And before long, the league isn't fighting critics, it's fighting invisibility. That's when the conversation shifts from what went wrong to what does this mean next? Because when a league loses visibility this fast, it doesn't just affect one season. It affects how networks, sponsors, and investors see the entire future. And that's where Unrivaled's collapse starts to echo beyond itself. At this point, the conversation stops being about fan opinions and starts becoming about money. Because while social media debates come and go, television executives don't operate on vibes. They operate on projections, guarantees, and risk. And what Unrivaled second season numbers introduced was uncertainty, the one thing networks hate more than bad press. Here's the reality most viewers never see. Media deals aren't built on one successful season. They're built on trust. Trust that audiences will return. Trust that advertisers will get exposure. Trust that the numbers won't collapse the moment novelty wears off. And Unrivaled just shattered that trust in real time. A league can survive modest ratings. It can survive criticism. What it cannot survive is volatility. When viewership drops this sharply in year 2, it signals that the audience was never anchored. That scares investors more than low numbers ever could, because low numbers can grow. Unstable numbers can't be trusted. Advertisers don't just buy eyeballs, they buy predictability. They want to know who's watching, when they're watching, and how consistently they'll return. A 70% drop tells them the audience isn't loyal. It's experimental. And experiments don't command premium dollars. That's when ad rates get adjusted downward. Sponsorship expectations soften. Long-term commitments suddenly include escape clauses and performance benchmarks. Everything becomes conditional. Networks feel it immediately. Primetime slots are valuable real estate. Every underperforming broadcast isn't just a disappointment, it's a lost opportunity. Something else could have filled that space. Something with steadier returns. When Unrivaled failed to hold attention in prime time, it didn't just hurt itself. It raised internal questions about future scheduling. Do you push it later? Do you move it off major nights? Do you reduce exposure? Every one of those decisions sends a message. And once that message circulates, perception shifts fast. What makes this even more sensitive is timing. The WNBA is approaching critical media crossroads. Future negotiations depend on leverage. Leverage depends on proof. And proof depends on sustained engagement. When a league positioned as a growth example suddenly collapses in its second year, it weakens the entire argument. Because networks don't isolate data points. They connect them. If Unrivaled, backed by stars, promoted as innovative and supported by modern metrics, can't hold viewers, it forces decision-makers to reassess how deep the audience actually runs. Not emotionally, numerically. And that's when optimism gets replaced by caution. Financial backers don't pull out overnight. They pull back slowly. Budgets get tightened. Expectations get lowered. Expansion plans get postponed. Everything becomes more conservative, more hesitant, more guarded. That hesitation is deadly for leagues built on momentum. Because momentum is a promise. It tells partners that today will be smaller than tomorrow. When that promise breaks, future planning shrinks instantly. And here's the part nobody wants to say out loud. Unrivaled wasn't just a league. It was a test case. A test of whether women's basketball could sustain interest beyond a debut moment. A test of whether modern audiences would commit long-term. A test of whether the growth narrative was rooted in habit or hype. When that test started failing, it didn't just reflect on Unrivaled. It reflected on everything connected to it. And now, the question isn't whether the league can survive another season. The question is whether the broader ecosystem can afford another example like this. Because once decision-makers start doubting the audience, the entire structure feels the pressure. This is the moment where Unrivaled stops being the headline and becomes the warning. Because no league operates in a vacuum. What happens to one affects perception of the entire ecosystem. And Unrivaled wasn't framed as just another alternative league. It was framed as evidence. Evidence that women's basketball had crossed a threshold. Evidence that demand was no longer fragile. Evidence that growth was sustainable, measurable, and permanent. That's why this collapse matters so much. When executives look at Unrivaled Season 2 numbers, they're not just evaluating one product. They're asking a far more dangerous question. Was the audience ever as deep as we were told? And once that doubt creeps in, it doesn't stay contained. The WNBA has spent years crafting a narrative built around expansion, increased relevance, and cultural momentum. And to be clear, the talent is real. The athletes are elite. The competition is legitimate. None of that is in dispute. But sports history is filled with talented leagues that failed because attention didn't follow ability. And attention is what this moment threatens. From a business standpoint, perception is currency. When growth is assumed, negotiations become aggressive. Networks compete. Rights fees rise. Exposure expands. But when growth is questioned, everything slows down. Caution replaces confidence. Unrivaled was supposed to strengthen the WNBA's leverage. Instead, it may have introduced uncertainty at the worst possible time. Because now, every claim about audience expansion comes with an asterisk. Every projection gets challenged. Every optimistic forecast gets quietly rechecked against recent data. Decision-makers don't argue publicly, they adjust privately. And that's what makes this situation so dangerous. The public narrative can stay positive. Headlines can still celebrate milestones. But behind the scenes, the tone changes. Growth becomes potential. Momentum becomes early stage. Sustainability becomes to be determined. Those words matter. They determine how much money flows into the league, how many prime-time opportunities are offered, how aggressively the product is marketed. When confidence dips, support doesn't vanish, it shrinks. And shrinking support is how leagues stall. Another uncomfortable truth sits right beneath the surface. The audience fragmentation problem isn't unique to Unrivaled. The WNBA has faced similar challenges before. Peaks during major moments, surges driven by star narratives, then drop-offs once the spotlight shifts. What Unrivaled exposed is how fragile those surges can be when they're not converted into habit. Sports leagues don't survive on moments. They survive on routines, weekly engagement, predictable tuning behavior. And Season 2 made it clear that many viewers didn't build that routine. That's why this moment feels heavier than a simple rating story. It suggests the gap between public enthusiasm and private viewing behavior may be wider than anyone wanted to admit. People support the idea. They celebrate highlights. They engage in conversation. But when it comes time to sit down and watch consistently, the numbers tell a different story. And numbers don't lie, they reveal patterns. This doesn't mean the WNBA is failing, but it does mean the path forward isn't as smooth as advertised. Growth isn't guaranteed. Attention isn't automatic. And sustainability isn't something you declare, it's something you prove over time. Unrivaled was supposed to be part of that proof. Instead, it became the stress test. And stress tests are brutal. They don't care about narratives. They expose weaknesses. They reveal where assumptions break down. And right now, the assumption that audience growth would simply carry forward has been shaken. Which leads to the most important question of all. Can this trajectory be reversed? Or was Season 1 always the high point? At this stage, the easiest thing to do would be to declare the situation hopeless. To frame this collapse as proof that the entire concept was flawed from the beginning. But that conclusion would be lazy, and more importantly, incomplete. Because while the damage is undeniable, the outcome isn't fully locked in yet. What is locked in is this. Season 1 created curiosity, not commitment. That distinction changes everything. Curiosity brings people in once. Commitment brings them back again and again. And Unrivaled never truly crossed that bridge. The league relied heavily on the idea that excitement would naturally convert into habit, that viewers who showed up for something new would automatically stay once the novelty faded. But modern audiences don't work that way anymore. Attention has to be constantly re-earned. If there is a path forward, it begins with confronting that reality head-on. Not spinning it, not reframing it, not burying it under optimistic language. A league cannot correct a problem it refuses to define accurately. Season 2 exposed multiple fractures at once. Promotion didn't just weaken, it practically vanished. Scheduling lacked urgency. Broadcast placement felt inconsistent. Messaging was unclear. And the overall presentation suggested a confidence that hadn't actually been earned yet. Those things matter more than people want to admit. Sports leagues don't survive on quality alone. They survive on repetition, on predictability, on making themselves unavoidable. When fans know exactly when and where to watch without checking, that's when loyalty forms. Unrivaled never reached that point. Instead, the league treated its audience like a finished product instead of a work in progress. And that miscalculation compounded fast. Because every missed reminder costs more than one viewer. It costs momentum. It breaks rhythm. It interrupts routine. When people fall out of habit, getting them back becomes exponentially harder. By the time leadership realizes something is wrong, the audience has already adjusted to life without the league. That's not a theory. That's behavior. Then there's the narrative problem. Season 1 had a clear story. New league, new energy, new moment. Season 2 didn't replace that narrative with anything equally compelling. There was no overarching reason for casual viewers to return. No must-see arc. No sense that missing a game meant missing something important. Without stakes, viewership becomes optional. and optional viewership is deadly. This is where leadership decisions start to matter more than talent ever could. Because recovering from a collapse like this isn't about fixing one issue. It's about rethinking the entire approach. That means acknowledging uncomfortable truths. It means accepting that the league may have been oversold too early. And it means resetting expectations in a way that doesn't alienate partners while still rebuilding trust. That's an incredibly narrow path to walk. On one side, admitting too much risk scaring off investors. On the other, denying reality guarantees further erosion. The solution requires precision, discipline, and patience, traits that are hard to maintain when pressure is mounting. And the pressure is mounting. Every season that follows now carries weight. Every broadcast becomes a referendum. Every rating drop becomes part of a larger pattern instead of an isolated event. The margin for error shrinks rapidly once confidence has been shaken. This is also where the conversation becomes uncomfortable for supporters. Because support in theory doesn't always translate to support in practice. People can believe in a league's mission, celebrate its athletes, and still not tune in consistently. That gap between belief and behavior is exactly what Season 2 exposed. The league didn't lose fans, it failed to convert them. Fixing that requires more than better marketing. It requires understanding why viewers didn't feel urgency. Why watching didn't become part of their weekly rhythm. Why the product didn't feel essential instead of optional. Those answers aren't flattering, but they're necessary. And the longer leadership avoids them, the harder recovery becomes. Because audiences don't wait. They move on. They fill their time with alternatives. They forget schedules. They lose emotional investment. Once that happens, winning them back takes far more effort than winning them initially. That's the danger Unrivaled now faces. Not collapse, stagnation. A slow settling into irrelevance where numbers stop shocking and start being expected. Where disappointment turns into indifference. Where the league still exists, still plays games, still features elite athletes, but no longer commands attention. That's the outcome everyone wants to avoid. And whether it can be avoided depends entirely on what happens next. Not what's said publicly, but what's changed privately. Because seasons don't fail overnight. They fail when warnings are ignored. And right now, every indicator suggests this was a warning, not a fluke. At some point, declining numbers stop being a surprise and start becoming a reputation. And that's the phase Unrivaled is drifting toward now, the most dangerous phase of all. Because once expectations reset downward, everything that follows is judged through a harsher lens. Early struggles are forgiven. Sustained struggles are remembered. Behind the scenes, pressure doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives quietly, through questions that sound harmless on the surface. Why did this game underperform? Why didn't this matchup bounce back? Why didn't this time slot improve? One question turns into two. Two turns into a review. And before long, every decision the league makes is being scrutinized instead of celebrated. This is when leverage starts slipping away. Networks don't make dramatic announcements when confidence fades. They adjust behavior. They offer fewer premium slots. They shift priorities. They hedge. And those hedges shape the league's future far more than public statements ever will. The same thing happens with advertisers. Brands don't pull funding overnight. They quietly reallocate budgets. Campaigns get smaller. Commitments get shorter. Everything becomes conditional. Performance-based. Trial-oriented. And once that mindset sets in, rebuilding trust becomes exponentially harder. The league begins operating in reaction mode instead of growth mode. And that changes internal decision-making too. Instead of asking how to expand, leadership starts asking how to stabilize. Instead of bold ideas, caution takes over. Innovation slows. Risk tolerance drops. The goal quietly shifts from growth to survival, even if no one says it out loud. That shift is subtle, but devastating. Because leagues built on ambition can't thrive in defensive posture. The moment the focus turns inward, the product starts shrinking psychologically, even if the games remain the same. Fans sense it. Partners sense it. Momentum evaporates. What makes this pressure so intense is that it's coming from multiple directions at once. Viewers are drifting. Networks are reevaluating. Advertisers are hesitating. And the media narrative, while still publicly optimistic, is no longer as confident behind the scenes. When enough people start asking the same questions privately, the answers start shaping outcomes. And then there's comparison, the quiet killer. Every underperforming broadcast gets measured against alternatives. other sports, other leagues, other content that fills similar time slots. If something else delivers steadier engagement, the argument for patience weakens fast. Because television is ruthless. It doesn't reward potential. It rewards results. This is where Unrivaled's positioning hurts it the most. It wasn't framed as a long-term experiment. It was framed as proof of concept, a finished product, a sustainable model. That framing raised expectations instantly. And when expectations are high, tolerance for volatility is low. That's why Season 2 didn't just disappoint, it destabilized. Because now every future projection has to explain why this collapse won't repeat itself. Every pitch has to justify why patience is still warranted. Every partner has to believe that this wasn't the ceiling, but a stumble on the way up. That's a hard sell when the data says otherwise. And the longer recovery takes, the more expensive it becomes. Not financially at first, reputationally. Once a league is associated with declining engagement, reversing that image takes sustained proof over multiple seasons. One bounce-back game won't do it. One strong week won't do it. Consistency becomes the only currency that matters. That's why the next phase is so critical. Because if pressure continues to build without visible change, the league risks crossing an invisible line, the point where stakeholders stop asking how to fix it and start asking whether it's worth fixing at all. That's the moment leagues fear most. Not collapse, not criticism, but irrelevance creeping in quietly while everyone pretends things are fine. And the most unsettling part? Once that shift begins, it's incredibly hard to reverse, no matter how much talent is on the court. Eventually, every league reaches a moment where avoidance is no longer an option, where explanations run out, where optimism stops working, and where the numbers demand a response instead of a narrative. For Unrivaled, that moment has arrived faster than anyone expected. This isn't about one bad season. It's about what that season represents. When viewership collapses this sharply in year 2, it forces a reset. Not a marketing reset, a philosophical one. Because the league now has to decide what it actually is, and what it's willing to become to survive. Reinvention is possible, but it isn't glamorous. It means shrinking before growing. It means resetting expectations. It means acknowledging that the audience wasn't as stable as advertised and rebuilding from that truth instead of pretending otherwise. That path requires patience, discipline, and humility, qualities that are difficult to maintain under public pressure. The alternative is far more dangerous. Irrelevance doesn't arrive with headlines. It arrives quietly, through smaller time slots, reduced promotion, shorter commitments, lower stakes. The league still exists, games still happen, athletes still compete, but the broader public stops paying attention. And once that happens, recovery becomes exponentially harder. That's the line Unrivaled is standing on now. This moment will define how the league is remembered, either as a project that overpromised, stumbled, and recalibrated, or as one that mistook attention for loyalty and never recovered from the difference. The outcome depends entirely on decisions made away from cameras and headlines. And those decisions won't be judged by press releases or mission statements. They'll be judged by behavior, by whether viewers return consistently, by whether partners regain confidence, by whether growth is demonstrated rather than declared. This situation also leaves a broader lesson behind, one that extends beyond Unrivaled itself. Modern sports audiences are harder to hold than ever before. Curiosity is easy to generate. Commitment is not. And no amount of branding can replace the hard work of earning attention week after week. Unrivaled didn't fail because the product lacked talent. It failed because talent alone wasn't enough to anchor an audience. The collapse didn't happen overnight. It revealed a foundation that was never fully secured. What happens next will determine whether this league becomes a cautionary tale or a recovery story. But one thing is already clear. Momentum can be manufactured. Sustainability cannot. And the numbers don't argue. They decide. If you care about what's actually happening behind the headlines, not the polished narratives, not the talking points, but the real numbers and real consequences, this is exactly why this channel exists. Stories like this don't end when the season ends. They evolve quietly, behind the scenes, long before the public notices. So if you want clear breakdowns, honest analysis, and updates that don't sugarcoat reality, make sure you're subscribed. Because when the next shift happens, you'll hear about it here first.